Henry Morrison sat motionless in his opulent study, its grandiose decor starkly contrasting with the hollow emptiness in his heart. The scent of polished mahogany and the faint echo of a ticking grandfather clock filled the silence, a silence that now felt deafening. Since the tragic loss of his only son, Oliver, in a harrowing car accident just weeks ago, Henry's once vibrant world had been reduced to ash. The accident had been sudden and brutal. Oliver, a vibrant 28-year-old with his whole life ahead of him, had been returning from a charity gala, a cause he passionately supported. The roads were wet from an unexpected downpour, and according to the police report, another car swerved into Oliver's lane. The impact was fatal. For Henry, the moment he received the call remains a frozen shard of time. The words, "We're sorry for your loss," replayed endlessly in his mind, like a cruel mantra. Henry had poured his soul into raising Oliver. The boy had been his pride and joy, a beacon of hope amidst the otherwise transactional and cold relationships that defined his wealthy social circle. Now that light was extinguished. In the days that followed, Henry avoided the bustling corridors of his estate. The staff moved like shadows, speaking in hushed tones. He had confined himself to this room, where memories of Oliver seemed to gather like ghosts. On his desk lay an unfinished letter Oliver had been writing to him. It was about a business idea. A startup focused on sustainable energy solutions. "Dad, I think this could really change things," the letter began. Those words, full of promise and enthusiasm, now mocked him. Photographs of Oliver adorned the walls. One caught Henry's eye, a candid shot of them fishing at their summer home by the lake. Oliver was laughing, holding up a modest catch, his face lit with unbridled joy. Henry's throat tightened as he recalled that day. It was one of the rare times they had both escaped the pressure of the family legacy. It was the last time Henry could remember feeling truly at peace. The grief was suffocating. Every corner of the house held memories, Oliver's favorite chair in the library, the piano he played so beautifully during holiday gatherings, and even the faint smell of his cologne lingering in the hallways. Henry found himself alternating between numbness and fits of despair. His mornings began with the hope that perhaps it had all been a nightmare. Reality, however, was unyielding. People around him were eager to help, but their efforts only deepened his isolation. His wife, Margaret, seemed to cope in her own way, burying herself in social obligations. To Henry, her actions felt like betrayal, but deep down he knew it was her way of managing the unmanageable. Still, her absence left him feeling more alone than ever. Henry's interactions with others had become strained. Business associates avoided the topic altogether, tiptoeing around his grief as if it were a fragile artifact that might shatter at a whisper. Friends urged him to seek therapy or to immerse himself in work, but their words barely registered. The idea of returning to his corporate empire, where every decision now felt trivial, seemed impossible. At night, sleep eluded him. When he did manage to drift off, the dreams came. They were vivid, cruelly so, images of Oliver walking into the room, calling out to him, or laughing at some shared joke. Each time, Henry would awaken with a start, his chest heaving, only to confront the unrelenting void once more. One evening, as Henry stared into the fireplace, a profound sense of humiliation washed over him. Here he was, a man who had conquered industries and built an empire, utterly powerless in the face of fate. His wealth, influence, and power, all meaningless now. What use was a sprawling estate or a collection of rare artifacts if he couldn't save the one thing that truly mattered? In a moment of rare vulnerability, Henry picked up Oliver's favorite book, To Kill a Mockingbird. He thumbed through its well-worn pages, pausing at passages underlined by his son. You never really understand a person until you consider things from his point of view, one passage read. Henry clenched the book tightly, tears streaming down his face. The irony wasn't lost on him. He would never again have the chance to understand his son more deeply, to share in his hopes and dreams, to simply be a father. As days turned into weeks, Henry's grief began to morph into a quiet, simmering rage, not at the driver, nor at Oliver, but at himself. He replayed their last conversation repeatedly. It had been brief, a phone call where Oliver had expressed excitement about the gala. Henry had been preoccupied, brushing him off with a curt, "That's great, son. We'll talk tomorrow." Tomorrow never came. This regret consumed him. He had been so focused on preparing Oliver to inherit the Morrison legacy that he had forgotten to simply cherish him. Every piano lesson, every summer internship, every carefully planned dinner with influential figures, it all seemed so pointless now. What Henry wouldn't give for one more fishing trip, one more lazy Sunday where they could just be father and son. Henry's grief became a cocoon, isolating him from the world. He avoided his reflection, unable to face the haggard man staring back. The weight of his sorrow was visible in his slumped shoulders and the dark circles under his eyes. Even his once commanding voice had become a hushed whisper, as if speaking too loudly might shatter the fragile shell he had built around his emotions. Yet, amidst the despair, a flicker of resolve began to stir. Oliver had often spoken of wanting to make a difference, to leave the world better than he had found it. If Henry could no longer be a father in the conventional sense, perhaps he could honor his son's legacy in another way. But for now, the pain remained, raw and unyielding, a constant reminder of all that he had lost. The funeral was a somber spectacle befitting the Morrison name. A cold drizzle fell over the cemetery, soaking the gathered mourners. Umbrellas bloomed like black flowers under the steel-gray sky, and the air was thick with the scent of damp earth and lilies. Henry Morrison stood motionless at the graveside, his face a pale mask of grief. His wife, Margaret, clutched his arm, her fingers digging into his sleeve as if anchoring herself to reality. But Henry felt untethered, a ghost among the living. The service was reverent, scripted, and elegant, every detail meticulously planned by Margaret and their staff. Dignitaries, business associates, and family friends filled the rows of folding chairs, murmuring prayers and platitudes. Henry heard none of it. His focus was on the polished mahogany casket that held what remained of his son, Oliver. The weight of his absence bore down on him like a physical force. As the minister's voice droned on, Henry's gaze drifted across the sea of faces. Familiar figures blended with strangers, those who knew Oliver from school, from his charitable work, or through Henry's vast business empire. It was during this scanning that Henry's eyes caught on something unusual. At the edge of the gathering, near a gnarled oak tree, stood a boy, dressed in a simple black coat too large for his frame. His pale face was framed by unruly dark hair that clung to his forehead in the rain. In his hands, he clutched a modest bouquet of white daisies. There was something haunting about his presence, an intensity in his dark eyes that unsettled Henry. The boy waited patiently as the mourners paid their respects. When the others stepped away, he approached the graveside with an air of quiet determination. His movements were deliberate, almost ceremonial, as he knelt and placed the daisies among the extravagant wreaths and arrangements already there. For a long moment he stayed like that, his head bowed as if in prayer. Henry watched, transfixed, a knot tightening in his chest. When the boy finally stood, he whispered something, a few words lost to the wind, and turned to leave. The scene was surreal, almost dreamlike, and yet it pierced through the fog of Henry's grief. Without thinking, he stepped forward, breaking away from Margaret and the throng of mourners. "Wait," Henry called, his voice low but commanding. The boy froze mid-step but didn't turn around. He hesitated, his shoulders tense, before finally facing Henry. Up close, his features were sharper, his eyes shadowed with something unreadable, pain, fear, defiance. "Who are you?" Henry asked, his tone both curious and urgent. "Did you know my son?" The boy's gaze flickered toward the casket, then back to Henry. For a moment, it seemed he might speak. His lips parted, and Henry leaned closer, his heart pounding. But instead of answering, the boy shook his head slowly. Then, as if deciding he had stayed too long, he spun on his heel and walked away, his figure disappearing into the mist. Henry stood rooted in place, his mind racing with questions. Who was this boy? Why had he come? And what had he whispered at the graveside? The moment felt charged with significance, yet the lack of answers left Henry with an unbearable sense of incompleteness. Back at the house, the reception was an exhausting parade of condolences and shallow conversations. Margaret floated through the room with practiced poise, thanking guests for their attendance, while Henry lingered on the periphery, his thoughts consumed by the mysterious boy. Every so often he scanned the crowd, half expecting the boy to reappear, but of course he didn't. "Henry, are you all right?" Margaret's voice broke through his reverie. "I'm fine," he replied stiffly, though the lie was obvious. Margaret gave him a searching look but didn't press further. She was used to his reticence, especially now. Later that night, long after the guests had gone and the house had fallen silent, Henry found himself in Oliver's room. It was untouched since the accident, a shrine to his son's memory. The air was heavy with the faint scent of Oliver's cologne. Henry ran his fingers over the desk, the bookshelves, the photographs on the walls. The image of the boy haunted him. His mind replayed their brief encounter, searching for clues. Why had the boy seemed so familiar, yet so foreign? And why hadn't he spoken? The questions gnawed at him, mingling with his grief until they became indistinguishable. By the time dawn broke, Henry had resolved to find out the truth. He began with Oliver's friends, calling them one by one under the pretense of thanking them for attending the funeral. Each conversation was a delicate dance, Henry probing for any mention of the boy without revealing his obsession. But no one seemed to know who he was. Next, Henry turned to Oliver's belongings, combing through his phone, his laptop, his journals. It felt invasive, even sacrilegious, but desperation drove him. He found nothing. No messages, no photographs, no entries that referenced the boy. It was as if he had appeared out of nowhere. Days turned into weeks, and the mystery deepened. Henry's grief became entangled with frustration, his inability to uncover the truth amplifying his sense of helplessness. His obsession with the boy began to strain his already fragile relationship with Margaret, who accused him of neglecting her and their shared mourning. "Why does this matter so much to you?" she asked one night, her voice quivering with exasperation. "Because he knows something," Henry replied, his voice taut. "I don't know what, but he knows something about Oliver." Margaret shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. "Oliver's gone, Henry. No amount of answers will bring him back." Her words cut deep, but they did nothing to quell his determination. The boy had left him with more than questions. He had left him with a sense of purpose, however painful. Henry clung to it like a lifeline, not yet realizing the depths to which it would lead him. The unease gnawed at Henry Morrison, a persistent itch that no amount of distraction could soothe. The memory of the strange boy at Oliver's funeral haunted him. Who was he, and why had he been there? The enigma consumed Henry, pushing him to take action. One rainy morning, he found himself seated in his study, dialing the number of a private investigator he had once used during a corporate dispute. The investigator, Daniel Proctor, was a sharp, no-nonsense man with a reputation for delivering results. He arrived at the estate the next day, his trench coat still slick from the rain, and listened intently as Henry described the boy. "I don't know his name. He looked about 16, thin, dark hair. He brought daisies to the funeral and walked away when I confronted him. That's all I have," Henry said, his frustration evident. Proctor nodded, jotting notes on a small pad. Funerals tend to be tight-knit events. A stranger would stand out, especially to staff or attendees. "I'll start by talking to anyone who was there. Caterers, groundskeepers, even the florist. Someone must have noticed him." Henry felt a flicker of hope. "I need to know who he is, Daniel. Whatever it takes." 4 days, Henry waited anxiously for news. Margaret noticed his restlessness and confronted him one evening as he paced near the fireplace. "This obsession with the boy, it's not healthy," she said, her voice a mix of concern and irritation. "You're avoiding your grief, Henry." He stopped pacing, glaring at her. "I'm not avoiding anything. If you'd seen the way he acted, the way he whispered at the grave, he knows something about Oliver. I can't just let it go." Margaret shook her head, exhaling sharply. "You're chasing shadows while I'm drowning in reality. Our son is gone, Henry. Focus on what's left." She walked away, leaving him stewing in a toxic mix of guilt and determination. The call from Proctor came late one night. "I found him," the investigator said without preamble. Henry gripped the phone tightly. "Who is he?" Lucas Fisher, 16 years old. Lives on the outskirts of town with his mother, Mary Fisher. They keep a low profile, no father in the picture. She works part-time at a diner, and he's homeschooled. Did he know Oliver? I haven't uncovered a direct link yet, Proctor admitted. But there's more. Lucas has a history of trouble, shoplifting, skipping school before his mother pulled him out. He doesn't fit with the crowd your son ran in. Something doesn't add up. Henry's mind raced. The boy's profile didn't match the image of someone close to Oliver. Yet, the conviction in Lucas's eyes at the funeral lingered in his memory. I want to meet them. Proctor hesitated. Are you sure that's wise? This could open a can of worms you're not ready for. I don't care, Henry snapped. Set it up. A few days later, Henry found himself driving to a rundown neighborhood on the edge of town. The contrast to his sprawling estate was jarring. Weathered houses with peeling paint, overgrown yards, and a sense of quiet despair hanging in the air. He parked outside a modest single-story home, its porch sagging under the weight of neglect. Mary Fisher answered the door. She was a thin woman with tired eyes and dark hair tied back hastily. There was a wariness in her expression as she looked Henry up and down. Can I help you? I'm Henry Morrison, he said, trying to keep his voice steady. I believe your son, Lucas, attended my son's funeral. I need to speak with him. Her face hardened, and she stepped partially into the doorway, blocking his view inside. Lucas doesn't talk to strangers. Whatever this is, leave us out of it. I'm not leaving until I get answers, Henry insisted, his tone sharper than he intended. Mary's jaw tightened. We don't owe you anything. Please, Henry said, his voice breaking. My son is dead. I need to understand why your boy was there. He's the only connection I have left. Mary's expression softened slightly, though her guard remained up. She glanced over her shoulder and called, Lucas? The boy appeared moments later, his face pale but composed. He looked at Henry with the same intensity he had shown at the graveside. Lucas, Mary said firmly, this man wants to know why you were at that funeral. Lucas hesitated, his eyes darting to the floor. I just wanted to pay my respects. To a boy you didn't know? Henry pressed, his frustration mounting. Tell me the truth. Lucas's face darkened, and he crossed his arms defensively. I didn't do anything wrong. Mary stepped between them, her voice low and warning. That's enough. You've had your answers. Now leave. Henry stared at them, his chest heaving with unspoken words. He felt humiliated, standing there like a beggar asking for scraps of clarity. The air was thick with tension, and for a moment, it seemed as if something might crack. But instead, Lucas turned and walked away, retreating into the shadows of the house. Mary closed the door firmly, leaving Henry alone on the porch, the sound of the latch echoing like a final word. The drive back to the estate was suffocating. Henry's mind churned with anger, confusion, and despair. Lucas's reaction only deepened the mystery, and Mary's protectiveness suggested there was more to the story. But how much more? And why were they so unwilling to share it? By the time Henry reached home, his resolve had hardened. He wouldn't stop until he unearthed the truth, no matter what it cost him. The revelation hit like a thunderclap in the still air of Mary Fisher's modest kitchen. Henry sat rigid in the wooden chair, the uneven table between him and Mary the only thing grounding him to the moment. Her words seemed to hang there, unyielding and impossible to ignore. Lucas, she said, her voice low but firm, is Oliver's son. Henry blinked, his mind rebelling against the statement. That's not possible, he managed, his voice cracking. Oliver never mentioned you. He would have told me. He didn't know, Mary interrupted, her tone hardening as if bracing for his disbelief. I never told him. The words struck Henry like a physical blow, robbing him of breath. He stared at Mary, her face a mixture of exhaustion and defiance. The seconds ticked by, each one amplifying the oppressive weight of the silence. You're lying, Henry said at last, though the words felt hollow even as he said them. He wanted to deny it, to erase the possibility, but there was something in Mary's expression, raw, unflinching, that made denial impossible. I have no reason to lie, Mary replied. She looked past him, her gaze distant, as if dredging up memories she'd buried long ago. Oliver and I met 4 years ago. It wasn't serious, at least not for him. I knew he had a life, a world I didn't belong to. But then I found out I was pregnant. By the time I worked up the courage to tell him, he was gone. Gone. Henry's voice rose, a mix of anger and confusion. Gone where? He stopped coming around, Mary said, her voice softening. Maybe he lost interest, or maybe he was just busy. I didn't know how to reach him. And honestly, I didn't want to. I knew who he was, who you are. I couldn't see a place for Lucas in that world. Henry's hands clenched into fists on the table. The implications of her words churned in his mind, a storm of emotions he couldn't contain. So you decided to keep him a secret? You decided my son shouldn't know he had a child? Mary's eyes flashed with anger. I decided what was best for my son. Oliver was kind, but he was young and reckless. I wasn't going to throw Lucas into a life of expectations and disappointments just to ease your family's conscience. Henry stood abruptly, the chair scraping loudly against the floor. You had no right, he hissed. No right to keep this from him, or from me. Mary rose as well, matching his intensity. And what would you have done, Henry? Raised him like you raised Oliver? Turned him into another cog in your empire? Lucas is better off without that. The accusations stung more than Henry cared to admit. He wanted to lash out to defend himself, but her words cut too close to the truth. The image of Oliver's frustrated smiles, the strained conversations about the future Henry had mapped out for him, all came rushing back. Had he really been a father, or just a taskmaster? Why now? Henry asked, his voice trembling. Why show up at the funeral? Why let Lucas go through that if you wanted to stay hidden? Mary hesitated, her resolve wavering for the first time. Because he wanted to know his father, she said quietly. He found out who Oliver was a few months ago. I couldn't stop him from going, and I didn't want to. He deserved that much. The room fell silent, the weight of her confession pressing down on them both. Henry sank back into his chair, his hands trembling as he tried to process the enormity of what he'd learned. He had a grandson. A living connection to Oliver, hidden in plain sight. The realization brought an unexpected flood of emotions, grief, shame, hope, but above all, a crushing sense of failure. He had spent years molding Oliver into his image, preparing him to take over the Morrison legacy, only to lose him before they could truly connect. And now, in Lucas, he saw the chance for redemption, though he feared he was unworthy of it. I want to meet him, Henry said at last, his voice barely above a whisper. Mary's expression hardened again. Lucas isn't a trophy, Henry. He's not a second chance for you to fix what went wrong with Oliver. He's my son, and I'll protect him from anyone who tries to use him. Henry's jaw tightened. I'm not trying to use him. He paused, struggling to find the right words. I need to know him. He's my grandson. Mary studied him for a long moment, her sharp gaze piercing through his carefully maintained composure. That's up to Lucas, she said finally. If he wants to see you, it'll be his choice. But don't push him. He's been through enough. Henry nodded reluctantly, knowing he had no leverage in this situation. The humiliation of being at Mary's mercy was nothing compared to the shame he felt for failing Oliver. He had spent his life demanding control, but now he was powerless. When Lucas finally entered the room, Henry's breath caught in his throat. The boy looked so much like Oliver at that age, the same intense eyes, the same unruly hair. But there was a guardedness in Lucas's posture that spoke of a life far removed from privilege and ease. Lucas, Henry began, his voice shaking. I don't know what to say. I'm sorry for everything. For not being there. Lucas shrugged, his expression unreadable. You didn't know. But I should have, Henry insisted. If I'd been a better father to Oliver, maybe. Don't, Lucas interrupted, his voice firm. Don't make this about you. The words stung, but Henry nodded. You're right. It's not about me. It's about you. And I want to be part of your life, if you'll let me. Lucas regarded him in silence, his eyes searching Henry's face. The seconds stretched into what felt like hours before he finally spoke. I'll think about it. It wasn't the answer Henry had hoped for, but it was more than he deserved. As Lucas turned and walked away, Henry felt a strange mix of hope and despair. He had been given a glimpse of a second chance, but it would be up to him to earn it. And for the first time in his life, Henry Morrison realized that his wealth and power meant nothing in the face of what truly mattered. Henry Morrison had spent his entire life solving problems with wealth and influence. When faced with a challenge, his instinct was to wield his power like a weapon, offering solutions through lavish gestures and resources. But as he attempted to connect with Lucas and Mary, he realized with growing humiliation that neither of them wanted what he was offering. He started with the obvious. A week after learning the truth, Henry returned to Mary's house with a proposal. He had arranged for an upscale apartment in a better neighborhood, one closer to the private schools he envisioned for Lucas. "You don't have to stay here," Henry said, gesturing at the peeling paint and overgrown yard. "I can give you something better, a real home, opportunities for Lucas that he'd never have otherwise." Mary's face was a mask of restrained anger as she folded her arms. "You think you can just buy your way into our lives? That this fixes everything?" "I'm not trying to fix anything," Henry argued, though he could hear the weakness in his own words. "I'm trying to help. Don't make this harder than it has to be." "You think this is hard for you?" Mary shot back. Her voice rose, trembling with fury. "You didn't spend 16 years raising a child alone, scraping by paycheck to paycheck. You don't get to show up now and play savior." Henry bristled but forced himself to remain calm. "I'm not trying to erase what you've done. I just want to make things better." "For who?" Mary snapped. "For you? So you can sleep better at night knowing you've thrown some money at the problem?" She stepped closer, her eyes blazing. "Lucas doesn't need a mansion or private school. He needs someone who cares about him. And so far, all I've seen is you trying to turn him into a project." Her words landed like blows, leaving Henry speechless. Mary let the silence hang between them before shaking her head and stepping back. "We don't want your money, Henry. We've been fine without it, and we'll keep being fine." Henry left, his pride wounded and his attempts to connect feeling like failures. But he wasn't ready to give up. Lucas was his grandson, his last link to Oliver, and Henry was determined to be part of his life. The next time he visited, he brought a different approach. Instead of material offerings, he came with an olive branch, tickets to a local baseball game. He remembered Oliver's love for the sport and assumed Lucas would share it. Lucas, however, was unimpressed. "I don't like baseball," he said flatly when Henry presented the tickets. "Oh," Henry said, caught off guard. "I just thought, well, Oliver loved baseball." "I'm not Oliver," Lucas replied, his tone laced with bitterness. The words stung more than Henry cared to admit. He tried to recover, forcing a smile. "What do you like then? Maybe we can do something else." Lucas shrugged, looking at the floor. "I don't know." "Stuff." Mary stepped in, her voice firm but not unkind. "Lucas doesn't need outings or grand gestures, Henry. He needs consistency. Show up when you say you will. Listen when he talks. That's what matters." It sounded so simple, yet for Henry, it was an alien concept. His relationships had always been transactional, rooted in what he could give or receive. Now, faced with the prospect of building a genuine connection, he felt exposed and uncertain. Over the next few weeks, Henry tried to do just that. He visited regularly, often bringing small gifts, books, puzzles, a new bike, but he quickly learned that Lucas was slow to warm up. The boy's initial politeness gave way to guarded silence, and Henry realized that his presence alone wasn't enough. One evening, as Henry sat awkwardly on Mary's worn sofa, Lucas surprised him by asking a question. "What was Oliver like?" The question froze Henry in place. He had spent so much time thinking about what Lucas might need that he hadn't prepared for the boy's curiosity about his father. "He was brilliant," Henry began, his voice trembling slightly. "Driven kind. He had this way of lighting up a room, making people feel like they mattered. He wanted to change the world." Lucas studied him, his expression unreadable. "Why didn't he know about me?" Henry hesitated, the weight of the question crushing. "He didn't know because I failed him," he admitted quietly. "I was too focused on other things, on work, on what I thought was best for him." I wasn't there for him the way I should have been. And because of that, I didn't give him the chance to know you. Lucas nodded slowly, though his expression remained distant. You're right. You weren't there. The bluntness of the statement humbled Henry, but he accepted it. He couldn't rewrite the past, but he could try to be present now. As the weeks turned into months, Henry began to find a rhythm. He stopped trying to impress Lucas and simply started being there. He helped with homework, listened when Lucas talked about his favorite video games, and even learned how to cook one of Mary's simple dinner recipes, a gesture that earned him a rare smile from her. It wasn't easy. Lucas often pushed back, testing Henry's patience with sharp remarks and cold silences. But Henry refused to give up, even when his own doubts crept in. One night, after a particularly tense day, Lucas finally opened up. You know, I didn't want to meet you, he said as they sat on the back porch. I thought you'd just make things worse. Henry swallowed hard, his chest tightening. And now? Lucas hesitated before shrugging. You're trying. That's better than I expected. The faint praise brought a lump to Henry's throat. For the first time in years, he felt a glimmer of hope, not because of what he could give, but because of what he could build. He realized that his wealth and power had always been shields, protecting him from vulnerability. But with Lucas, those shields were useless. For the first time, Henry saw a future not built on legacy or achievement, but on something far more meaningful, family. And though the road ahead was uncertain, he was ready to walk it, one step at a time. The Morrison estate, sprawling and opulent, had always been a symbol of Henry's success. Its grand halls echoed with his accomplishments, its manicured gardens a testament to the wealth and power he had accumulated over a lifetime. But now, as Henry stood on the balcony overlooking the grounds, he felt nothing but emptiness. The house was silent, a mausoleum of his past, and for the first time, he saw it for what it truly was, a gilded cage. The decision to sell came suddenly, though not without deliberation. Henry had spent months trying to balance his old life with his growing involvement in Lucas and Mary's world. The more time he spent with them, the more the mansion and all it represented felt like a grotesque reminder of his misplaced priorities. His wealth, once a source of pride, now seemed burdensome, an obstacle to the simplicity he had come to cherish. Margaret was the first to hear of his decision. She reacted with disbelief and a touch of anger, her voice rising as they sat in the cavernous dining room one evening. Sell the house, she repeated, her tone incredulous. Henry, this estate has been in our family for generations. It's part of who we are. No, Henry said quietly but firmly. It's part of who I was. It's not who I want to be anymore. Margaret's eyes narrowed, her frustration boiling over. This is about them, isn't it? Mary and Lucas. You're throwing everything away for people you barely know. I'm not throwing anything away, Henry replied, his voice steady. I'm trying to build something real. Something I never gave Oliver, and something I've never given myself. Margaret stared at him, her lips pressed into a thin line. And what about me? Am I supposed to just give up everything we've built? We built this, Henry said, gesturing around the room, but it didn't save us. It didn't save Oliver. Maybe it's time to let it go. The conversation ended in a tense silence, and Margaret left the room without another word. Henry knew he was asking for a sacrifice she might never understand. Yet, for the first time in his life, he felt certain he was doing the right thing. The sale of the estate was a spectacle, drawing the attention of the media and society alike. Reporters speculated about the reasons behind the decision, some suggesting financial trouble, others citing personal scandal. Henry ignored it all, focusing instead on the new chapter he was determined to create. The move to a modest suburban home was jarring, not just for him but for everyone who knew him. The house was small by comparison, 2 bedrooms, a tiny backyard, and a creaky porch that needed repainting. For Henry, it felt liberating. For Lucas, it was a source of amusement. This is where you're going to live? Lucas asked skeptically as he helped Henry unpack boxes one Saturday afternoon. It's kind of old. Henry chuckled, wiping sweat from his brow. It has character, he said, pulling a dusty lamp from a box. Besides, it's not the house that matters. It's the people in it. Lucas rolled his eyes but didn't argue, a faint smile tugging at his lips. Mary, too, was surprised by the move. She had grown used to Henry's grand gestures and the barriers his wealth created, and seeing him step away from that world left her both impressed and wary. "You're really doing this?" she asked one evening as they stood in the kitchen, unpacking groceries. Henry nodded, a rare softness in his expression. "I want to be part of your lives. Not as some distant benefactor, but as family." Mary regarded him carefully, searching for signs of insincerity. When she found none, she nodded. "Just don't expect applause. Lucas isn't going to suddenly trust you overnight." "I know," Henry said, "but I'm willing to wait." Life in the new home was a far cry from the luxury Henry had once known. Gone were the staff who catered to his every need, the endless space that allowed him to retreat into solitude. Now, he found himself mowing the lawn, fixing leaky faucets, and learning to navigate the quirks of a neighborhood where everyone knew each other's names. At first, the adjustment was awkward. Henry's attempts to bond with Lucas were met with skepticism, and his efforts to help Mary often felt clumsy. But over time, something shifted. The barriers between them began to erode, replaced by moments of genuine connection. One evening, as the three of them sat around the small dining table eating spaghetti Henry had learned to make from Mary, Lucas asked a question that caught him off guard. "Did you ever go fishing with my dad?" Henry paused, the fork halfway to his mouth. "We did," he said, his voice tinged with nostalgia. "We used to go to a lake near our summer house. He loved it." Lucas nodded thoughtfully. "Maybe we could go sometime." The suggestion was so casual, so unexpected, that Henry felt tears prick the corners of his eyes. "I'd like that," he said, his voice thick with emotion. The days began to take on a new rhythm. Henry attended Lucas's soccer games, cheered louder than anyone else, and marveled at the boy's determination on the field. He helped Mary with household chores, learning to patch drywall and even planting a small vegetable garden in the backyard. The simplicity of their lives brought him a joy he hadn't known he was capable of feeling. But it wasn't without its challenges. Henry still struggled with his old habits, offering money when he didn't know how else to help, trying to fix problems instead of simply listening. Mary was quick to call him out, her sharp words a necessary reminder of what truly mattered. "You don't need to solve everything, Henry," she said one afternoon as they sat on the porch, watching Lucas play with the neighbor's dog. "Just be here. That's enough." Her words stayed with him, reshaping the way he approached their relationship. For the first time, Henry allowed himself to simply exist in the moment, without the need to control or impress. As the seasons changed, so did Henry. The man who had once measured his worth in dollars and deals now found fulfillment in the quiet moments. Lucas's laughter, Mary's rare but genuine smiles, the warmth of a home filled with life. The mansion and all it represented felt like a distant memory, a relic of a life he no longer wanted. One crisp autumn evening, as they sat around a crackling fire in the backyard, Lucas turned to Henry and said, "You're different now. Not like when we first met." Henry smiled, his heart swelling with gratitude. "Maybe I finally figured out what's important." Lucas grinned, tossing a marshmallow into the flames. "Took you long enough." The words were light-hearted, but they carried a truth that Henry embraced. For the first time in his life, he was no longer chasing success or approval. He had found what he'd been missing all along, a family that loved him not for what he could give, but for who he was. And in their warmth, he discovered a happiness he never thought possible.